Inner Chaos by Grevin Hades. Chapter 20. Hit the Books. Grevin stifled a small yawn as he made his way up the dirt path to Sweet Apple Acres, his mind still trying to make sense of the night's events. He hoped that with a few hours of decent sleep would put things into a different perspective and perhaps give him an idea of what to do next. He kept his eyes towards the ground, watching his feet kick up little tufts of dust with each step, when a sharp whistle pulled his attention from his thoughts and drew it to the shadowy barn. There, in the darkness, stood Applejack, waving at him with a soft smile on her face. Well, that was until she got a good look at the blood on his armor that he carried in his arms. She quickly ran forward, her eyes wide as she quickly looked him over, moving around him once, checking to see if he was hurt, before hopping up and placing her hooves on his shoulders.
"Raven, what happened? Are you all right, Sugar Cube?"
He placed a hand on her chest and gently pushed her back onto her hooves, while he took a small step back. "I'm all right, Applejack. I just had a small run-in with an unsavory character. I heard a mare being attacked by what I later learned were changelings. Thankfully, I was able to help her and escorted her back to Ponyville. After that, I went to Twilight's house to send a letter to the princesses about what happened. That's why I'm getting back so late." Applejack sighed and sat back on her haunches, wiping her foreleg across her forehead, before looking up at him with tired eyes.
"I'm glad you're all right, though I don't like the idea of changelings running around. Of course, with you around, we won't have anything to worry about."
He shook his head, a small sigh escaping him. Applejack raised an eyebrow and tilted her head to the side at his unease. Grevin looked her in the eyes and gave a soft but sad smile. Maybe not. I got a bit too agitated when fighting, and things got a bit too rough for my liking." He began to make his way towards the barn, Applejack following in step behind him.
"What do you mean? You look a mite bit upset."
He reached up with his free hand and brushed it through his hair a moment, before glancing over at her. "It felt good to be fighting again, Applejack. I'm worried that I could be a threat." For a moment, she said nothing before giving a snort and shaking her head, letting her still wild and loose mane shake over her shoulders and back.
Shoot, I thought it was something serious. Of course you're a threat to your enemy. You're stronger than Big Macintosh and fast, too. Not to mention you're an experienced fighter."
He shook his head once more, closing his eyes a moment as they came to the barn door. He turned to face her and knelt down, letting his armor rest against the wood structure while looking into her green eyes. "Applejack, I'm afraid I'll become a threat to you, your family, and your friends. Everyone I've come to accept into my life after I came here. The last thing I want to do is cause harm to anyone who has shown me kindness." Applejack smiled and sat down before him, while at the same time reached up with a hoof and placed it on his shoulder.
"Grevin, I know you would never do anything to cause us harm. It's not who you are."
She paused, noting his eyes seemed to darken a bit, before looking away, averting his gaze. "I hope you're right, Applejack. I don't want to go back to how I used to be." She smiled and nodded, deciding to change the subject.
"All right, I have to ask. Did Fluttershy make it home okay? She did drink quite a bit."
He blushed and looked away, clearing his throat a bit before answering. Yes, she made it home just fine." Something wasn't right with his answer. She leaned in, narrowing her eyes.
"Are you sure, Sugar? Did anything happen? You seem nervous."
He blinked and backed up as she neared, her proximity making him more nervous. He didn't know how any of the girls would react to what had occurred that night, and he didn't want to risk putting a rift between any of them.
Me? Nose? No, not at all. I'm fine. Nothing happened at all. He averted his gaze to the left once more, which only confirmed Applejack's suspicions. Don't lie to me. I'm the holder of the element of honesty, you know, so out with it. He nearly fell back onto his rear as she continued to press in, stepping closer. He could tell she wasn't going to let this drop, so he took a steadying breath before speaking. All right. Fluttershy, I'm pretty sure Fluttershy came on to me, but I'm also fairly certain that it was because of the alcohol, so I'm not going to try and make anything of it. Applejack blinked and pulled back, a small pang of jealousy appearing in her chest, while fear began to grow in her mind. What do you mean by came on to you?
Well, she asked me into her cottage, and before I could leave, she asked me to help her out of the costume. After that, she asked me if I could give her a small massage because her costume made her stiff and sore. I thought I was helping a friend out, but then she turned around and things became awkward. She kissed me and asked me to stay around, but I left, and that's when I ran into those changelings attacking a pony.
Applejack felt her cheeks redden at the thought of timid little Fluttershy taking such a risk. She felt envious of her friend, but angry at her at the same time. Was that all? He shook his head after a moment of hesitation.
Well, no. The man I saved gave me a kiss on the cheek when she got home, and then, well, after I asked Twilight to send a letter to the princesses, well, she kissed me as well. But I think that was because of the drinking, too. I mean, that would make the most sense, right?
Applejack frowned and looked down at her host as her mind raced. Not only did Fluttershy kiss him, but Twilight, too? If those two could do it, why couldn't she? Why couldn't she just come out and tell him her feelings? At the same time, she felt anger to begin to grow in her chest, only making her worries grow. Did he enjoy it? Would he want to do it again? What would this mean? She may not have a chance at him? Could it mean that he didn't have any kind of feelings for her? She had to know. Graven, did you enjoy it? He blinked.
What?
She looked into his eyes, her own shimmering with worry. Did you enjoy the kissing? Would you want to do it again? He paused and looked away for a few silent moments, taking a slow breath.
I suppose I did enjoy it. It was pleasant, but I think they were under the influence, and as for wanting to do it again, well, to be honest, I don't know a person who wouldn't want to do that again. It felt good, but...
Applejack frowned and gritted her teeth as she felt her jealousy grow, and without a second thought she lashed out, striking a firm hoof across his face, catching him off guard and knocking him to the side. Griffin winced as his vision blurred and jerked to the side, followed by a slow, throbbing pain beginning to flow from his jaw. He turned his head back and looked at the upset mare with wide eyes.
Applejack, what was that about?
She closed her eyes as she felt them begin to water, more upset at her own actions than with anything he said or did, and raised her head, turning away from him. If you enjoyed those kisses so much, maybe you should go back to those two instead of hanging out here on the farm. He blinked and shook his head, his confusion showing in his eyes.
What? I don't understand. Are you angry with me? Have I done something wrong? I'm sorry if I have. I certainly didn't mean to.
Rather than answer him, Applejack trotted away, her tail flicking in annoyance, leaving the man in a state of utter confusion. Slowly, Griffin rose to his feet and lightly cradled his jaw in his hand.
What was that all about?
He rose back to his feet and made his way into the barn while he tried to make sense of everything that happened that night. He stepped into his loft and set his armor down, spreading it out along a wall, including all his weapons, before moving back and crossing his arms, staring at them. He needed some space. He needed time to think, so he knew what he had to do. Without a sound, he moved to his makeshift bed and took his ever-familiar cloak, slipping it on as he made his way to the stairs. He slipped out of the barn as quietly as he could and made his way towards the orchard, only glancing back at the farmhouse as he walked past, taking note that the light in Applejack's room was still on. He looked away and broke into a light jog, letting his thoughts calm and fade while he moved deeper and deeper into the orchard. As he moved further, he couldn't help but enjoy the cool air that washed over his face and the steady rhythm of his feet pushing off from the earth. After a half hour, it began to slow as he came to a large hill that overlooked Ponyville in the distance, and sat himself down against a tree while taking a deep, cleansing breath. He allowed his mind to wander back to the night's events and tried to make sense of everything that had occurred. Could he have done anything differently? If so, what? Could he have stayed with Fluttershy? No, that wouldn't have ended well. It couldn't have. He didn't even know if he and ponies were compatible, let alone if she really felt that way about him, or if it was a result of the drink she had. Not to mention, how would her friends react to it when they found out? Then there was everything that happened with Twilight. Should he have waited to speak to her till morning? Should he not have mentioned how he felt during the fight? No, he needed to inform the princesses of his actions in case he did become a threat. However, he should have left directly after that, instead of staying around. Now he wasn't sure if things between him and Twilight would be awkward, or as normal as it was before. Then there was the case of Applejack, who seemed to get very upset with him in a very short period of time. Did she have strong feelings for him as well? Or was she just being protective of a friend who didn't want him kissing her friends? He just couldn't tell. Perhaps he had done something unintentionally to upset her. For now, though, he knew he should give her some space. And what about Princess Luna? It was pretty clear she had some sort of feeling for him, but to what extent? A fun friend? A passing fancy? A true passion? It wasn't clear at all. Of course, he was certain that she couldn't act on any sort of feeling, though, due to her status. And Bastion royalty was never allowed to do anything with commoners. It was considered to be disgusting, although this wasn't Bastion either. That, of course, raises the question as to if it was even possible for a pony and he to have such a relationship. How would it work? Would equestrian society allow such a thing? What was considered the social norm? What the hell were these herds he had heard mentioned from time to time? Would any pony he had a relationship with be looked down upon by others? He had a small guess on some things, but nothing certain. He did have a solid gut feeling on one item, though, and that was that in this land, mares were far more dominant than stallions, and had far more control over things than them. This could be something as simple as government power to something more complex, including how relationships are established. It was all quite confusing, and he just wasn't certain about any of it. He continued to wrestle with his thoughts as the night began to give way to morning, when a cold wind slammed into him, pulling him from his thoughts. He shivered at the chill and glanced around, noting that there were no other creatures around him, but something felt off. A slow, dark laugh began to echo around him, causing him to narrow his eyes and his fists clench. He had heard that laugh before, in the royal palace in Canterlot. He rose to his feet and looked around once more, trying to seek out a threat, his fists clenching at his sides. Discord, what are you doing here? A magical mist began to swirl a few feet in front of him, and with a bright, blinding flash of light, Discord appeared, floating nonchalantly on his back with his arms behind his head. He had a simple pair of sunglasses on his face and a colorful Hawaiian t-shirt on. Well, Mr. Hades, how are you doing? I just returned from a wonderfully restful vacation, and I thought I'd check in to see how the newest resident of Equestria was doing. He snapped his fingers, and 2 coconut drinks with straws coming out the top appeared in his hands. He held one out to Grevin with a smirk. Here, care to have a drink? It's a favorite of the Southern Islands. Very fruity, and it's even good for your heart. Grevin stared at the drink being offered to him, before smacking it out of Discord's hands, spilling it over the ground below. You have a lot of nerve showing up here. If I had my swords, I'd... You do what? Discord raised his glasses with his now free hand and took a sip of his drink while rolling his eyes. You'd slice me up and serve me to Celestia? And Luna on a silver platter? Please. That's so boring and unoriginal. He snapped his fingers once again and disappeared, only to pop up behind Grevin and place a firm hand on his shoulder. Besides, I doubt you could even touch me. Even with all your strength and combat knowledge, I could just snap my fingers and you would strike nothing but air. Grevin growled, clenching a fist, and turned as fast as he could in an attempt to strike the Lord of Chaos, only to whiff through the air, hitting nothing. What? Tisk, tisk. I told you that it was pointless. Grevin's Discord smirked as he floated upside down behind the man. Grevin turned, taking a slight defensive stance, expecting a fight for his life. What is it you want, Discord? Are you going to unleash another beast on those who live here and kill more? Discord righted himself and placed a hand over his heart, looking at Grevin with wide eyes. Why would you think I would kill anyone, my dear boy? I find that idea outright offensive. I've never killed anyone in Canterlot. That was all the dragon's doing. Grevin narrowed his eyes, which you pulled from my mind, my memories. Discord smirked darkly, his fang gleaming in the morning light. Well, I just provided a means for him to enter our world. I never created him. So perhaps you should be the one to blame. It was as you said, your memory. Grevin growled and lunged forward once more in an attempt to tackle the Draconequus, but once again ended up finding only air and ended up sliding a few feet on the dirt. I did everything I could to help them. Don't you dare hint that I'm responsible for the death and destruction that happened that day. Discord laughed and sat down on Grevin's back. All right, you can calm down, Mr. Hades. I'm not here to fight. Grevin rolled to his side, trying to remove the weight from his back, and quickly jumped to his feet, while Discord continued to float in the air. Then why are you here? Discord held out his hand, where the coconut drink reappeared once again. I took a long drink before answering. Why, I'm here to give you a gift, my dear boy. Grevin's eyes widened, and he let his hand slowly drop, before taking a small step back. What did you say? Discord smirked and took another slow drink. I said I'm here to give you a gift for all the chaos you've been causing. Grevin frowned once more and crossed his arms. What the hell are you talking about? Well, my boy, from the moment you arrived, everything has been different in Equestria. Let's start with just you. When you first arrived, you had terrible nightmares. Those dreams were so chaotic. I could feel them all the way in Canterlot. I can still feel them from time to time now and when you have them. It's almost as though you're at war with yourself. He rolled his eyes and looked away. Yeah, I've had some bad dreams, so what? Fine, then let's move on to how you are being more involved with the chaos. I'm sure you've noticed that some mares are beginning to take a liking to you. They've fallen for your kindness, your bravery, your willingness to self-sacrifice. All quite dull, in my opinion, but it can cause a small chaotic moment here and there, such as your little interaction with the ever-stubborn Applejack a few minutes ago, or even your little moment of fun with dear Fluttershy and Twilight. If things keep going this way, more of the element bearers will become more and more chaotic, and then the elements will begin to fail, thus allowing me to be free forever. He grinned deviously as he lightly elbowed Grevin in the ribs. And you might end up with quite the following. Grevin took a deep breath, only to find a piece of tape placed across his mouth. He glared at Discord, who simply smirked before continuing. Then there are the rumors that have begun to spread about you. A valiant warrior who killed a dragon with the aid of the captain of the royal guard. Then it becomes a mysterious warrior that killed a dragon all on his own, followed by some saying that there was a mystical creature who can heal wounds, be thrown into buildings without harm, and can slay dragons, ponies, and lizards in a single blow. After that, paranoia takes over, and now there are rumors in Canterlot and Trothingham about how this beastly strong warrior that can't be hurt rampaged through Canterlot Market on a five-headed dragon, attacking ponies left and right. It becomes so silly that several ponies have begun to stockpile food and build shelters in an attempt to prepare for the end. Discord walked over and placed a hand on Grevin's shoulder. Face it, my boy, you've been able to cause a good bit of chaos in your time here. Granted, you're not as good as me, but a fine attempt. Grevin growled as he reached up and ripped the tape from his mouth, ignoring the pain. All right, I'm causing a ripple in society. So what? So what? My boy, if these ponies didn't have any chaos or danger in their lives, things would be so, boring. I hate it when things are boring. They need something to keep them lively and on their toes from time to time. And you're perfect. So since things have been going so well, I've decided to give you a gift. All right, and what is this gift? Discord shook his head and waved a finger out in front of him. No, it's not fun if I just tell you. I think you need to flex your brain a bit. All this running around fighting things, your mind is a muscle too, you know. So I'm going to hint at where you can find your gifts. It's up to you to find them before anything else. Grevin frowned, taking a step forward. What do you mean before? Discord cleared his throat and held out a hand, silencing the man once more. A surprise will be found in a place where many ponies become lost, where everything began, and a particular pony paid a great cost. A place with secrets to be found and wild threats abound. A place where there are runes and a connection to the moon. Two things shall appear, perhaps welcomed, perhaps feared. Will the spectral knight do what is right? Will he win, or will he lose this fight? Only time will tell if everything ends well. Grevin blinked and crossed his arms. What is that supposed to mean? Is it a riddle? Discord grinned and laughed as it began to lift into the air and fade away. That's for you to figure out, hero. I'm off to the west now. I hear there are some great pies. I have to try with the buffalo folk. Ta-ta for now. Grevin watched with a grim stare as the Lord of Chaos disappeared into the morning light. He sighed and turned away, deciding to make his way back to the barn to get some rest before Big Mac would need his help in the fields that day. He shrugged off his cloak and draped it over his arm as he tried to make sense of what Discord was telling him. The riddle was something that he wasn't certain he could figure out. As far as he could tell, there were several places ponies could get lost, and while the creatures apparently weren't something that were rare in Equestria, he had heard stories of dragons, hydras, and even manticores, so this location needed to stand out. Then there was the line about secrets. With this society being so open, what secrets could there be? Certainly there would be some secrets only Princess Celestia and Luna would know, but other than that, what would be left? Piggy Pie's cupcake recipe? He shook his head, a small sigh escaping him as the barn came back into view. He glanced around, noting how quiet things seemed, but he paid it no mind, thinking that perhaps things were off to a slower start due to Nightmare Night. He made his way to the barn and then to his loft, letting his mind finally clear of everything, his energy leaving him as he neared his bed. He flopped down with a soft grunt, closing his eyes, knowing that once his chores were finished that day, he would need to head back into Ponyville and see Twilight to begin their research. Perspective change. Grevin found himself back in Ponyville on what seemed to be an average day. However, something wasn't quite right. He looked up and noticed the sky was blood red, with black clouds moving slowly through the air. The sun seemed faded and dim compared to how it usually looked. There were no ponies running around like normal, and in fact, it seemed like the village was a ghost town. What the? A pair of hooves wrapped around his shoulders from behind, a soft form pressing into his back as it tried to hug him. "Hiya, Grevy. How are you on this beautiful day?" He relaxed, hearing Pinkie Pie's cheery voice. He pulled away from her hooves, letting her stand on the ground as he turned to face her, taking note of how her long, uncurled mane, similar to the way she wore it on Nightmare Night. Hi, Pinkie. I'm doing all right. Where is everyone?" Pinkie sighed as her eyes narrowed a bit. "Pony. Every pony. It's every pony. I keep telling you this." She moved past him, letting her tail smack lightly against his leg as she did. "As to where every pony is, well, I don't know. Maybe Twilight would know. She is really smart, you know." He frowned and glanced away. "Well, I don't think I want to see her at the moment. Perhaps I should just walk around for a while." The normally bubbly mare turned her head, looking at him with a frown. "Why wouldn't you want to see your friend?" He ran his fingers through his hair, turning his back to her as he took a few steps down the street. "Well, it's a little complicated, Pinkie." He tensed when he felt a small breath of warm air wash across his neck, tickling his skin, followed by a soft voice speaking almost seductively in his ear. "Is it because she kissed you? Silly Grevy." He quickly turned, expecting to see Pinkie Pie standing right behind him, but to his surprise, she remained several feet away, her back turned to him, keeping her face hidden. He blinked a bit and swallowed the lump in his throat, knowing that something wasn't right. "Well, that's part of it, I suppose."
"You shouldn't let that bother you."
Pinkie's voice began to change, growing more somber, losing its normal bubbly, cheery tone, and shifting into something darker.
"After all, I think there are worse things to worry about."
He frowned, taking a small step back, his hands reaching for his weapons, only to find them missing. "I'm assuming you mean Discord." For a few seconds she said nothing, her body simply beginning to shake. Soon she began to laugh, softly at first, then louder and louder, her voice shifting and changing further until it sounded as though there were many voices speaking at once.
"You think I meant that, Grevy? Silly Grevy."
She turned her head, and what he saw nearly made Grevin become ill. Gone was the bright smiling face of the element of laughter, and in her place was something twisted and sick. Her mane had become dark and covered with some sort of slimy substance that made it cling to her face. Her smile was replaced by a twisted grin that seemed nearly psychotic, her teeth jagged and yellow. Her face covered in open wounds and sores, pus dripping and seeping with every passing second. But worst of all were her eyes. Gone were her bright, innocent blue eyes, and in their place were two sockets filled with a black tar-like substance that seemed to swirl on their own, the edges of her eyes surrounded by writhing worms and maggots.
"I meant that you should be worried about what's in your head."
Grevin did the best he could to swallow the bile that formed in the back of his throat, while quickly stepping backward, putting more distance between himself and the twisted version of his friend. "All right, perhaps so. Now I should be going. I'll see you later. He began to back away further, doing his best to keep the nightmarish mare in his sight, watching her carefully as he quickened his pace. But he didn't make it far when he felt another set of arms slide around his middle, while another soft form pressed against his back. He could feel the steady brush of wind across his arms, telling him that it was one of the two mares that had caught him. He shivered when he felt a nibble on his earlobe and tried to pull forward, only to feel the arms under him lock under his armpits, holding him in place. A soft, raspy voice giggled and softly bit down on his shoulder, causing him to wince. He tensed further as he felt a tongue clearly begin to lick at his exposed skin, tasting his sweat.
Now, we can't let you leave yet.
His eyes widened in surprise as he recognized the voice. Rainbow Dash. Griffin jerked his arms a few moments, managing to free himself from the darker version of the element of loyalty, frowning as he turned to face her and to see her nightmarish form. Much to his surprise, it was nowhere near as harsh as what had been done to Pinkie Pie, but it was still quite disturbing to him. Instead of the ghastly wounds and disgusting images, she looked mostly the same. However, she had dark circles under her now blood-red eyes. Her teeth seemed to be jagged and sharp, ready to rend the flesh from bone. Her wings were flared wide, and blood could be seen in small splotches across them. She wore a set of dark socks, and there was a trace of blood on her cheek. Dash, what the hell happened to you? She smirked and moved forward, forcing the man to step back, her blood-red eyes locking onto his as a sultry smirk came across her lips.
Why, you don't like the look?
With a mighty flap of her wings, she shot forward, tackling him to the ground, her hooves pinning his arms down while her face moved inches from his, giving a small, flirty wink.
I thought you would enjoy it. After all, I don't put on socks for any old stallion.
Her breath was rancid and hot against his skin, forcing him to turn his head to the side in an attempt to avoid the smell. It was as though she had been feasting on rotten flesh for days. I'm honored, but ugh. He jammed his knees up into her side, causing her to wince and pull away, giving him the opportunity to put some space between them. I think another stallion would appreciate it more. Dash narrowed her eyes at her prey and bared her teeth as a feral growl escaped her throat. She stomped a hoof down and shook her head, her wild mane flinging about.
No, I want you and I'm going to get you.
Her eyes seemed to shrink as her tone became more unstable.
I'm going to make you like me. I'm going to make you a part of me just like the others.
She licked her lips as blood began to drip from her mouth, pulling on the ground in front of her. Griffin grimaced at the mental image of this twisted version of his friend eating a pony or person alive. It would explain the breath, though. I don't think so. I'm not into that kind of thing. He rolled onto his knees and quickly rose up, breaking into a run, an infuriated scream reaching his ears, telling him not only was the cannibal Rainbow Dash and the twisted Pinkie Pie behind him, but they were not happy. He knew this had to be a dream. No, it was a nightmare, and he needed to wake up, but he wasn't sure if he could. He quickly rounded a corner, which took him in front of what he would describe as a burned-out husk of what used to be the Carousel Boutique, and began to smack himself across the face, hoping that the pain would pull him from his slumber and pull him back to reality. Sadly, his idea did nothing, leaving him only with a sore jaw.
Hey, if you're into pain, I'm sure we can have lots of fun. Come back and find out, Griffin.
Dash called out behind him, snickering darkly as she spoke. Griffin shook his head, ignoring the sick mare, and tried to run faster, while pinching his arm till he nearly bled. He had to wake up. He needed to wake up. Unfortunately for him, he failed to pay attention to where he was going, and as he rounded a turn, he didn't could see a long, armored arm shoot out from in front of him, which caught him by the neck and threw him to the ground, knocking the wind from him and forcing his vision to darken for several seconds as he squirmed on the ground. Griffin wheezed and gasped for breath while the dust began to settle around him, and as he was finally able to gather his wits, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Standing over him was a man wearing black, spiked armor, a long, dark scimitar in his hand, pointing down against his chest. The mysterious man was no stranger to Griffin, not in the slightest. This was the man he was hunting back in Bastion. He was the one who wanted to enslave the entire world and rule it with an iron fist, sparing no one from his anger and wrath. He was the one who had used Griffin's first love to try and kill him. Griffin growled as he grit his teeth, his anger barely in check.
Davik, why are you here? I thought I left you in Bastion.
The man simply smirked and shook his head, a dark laugh escaping him.
You fool, of course you left me back in Bastion. Well, the real me. Do you remember this is a dream?
He raised a finger and lightly tapped his head.
We're in here, in your mind. You're the only one allowing me to be here talking to you. This place, these creatures that were your friends.
He spread his arms out, looking around at the strange version of Ponyville.
Are all a sick part of your twisted little mind.
Griffin slowly raised himself up on his elbows, shaking his head.
No, this is something more. This is some kind of twisted, disgusting magic that forces me to dream this. It's something you did to me.
Davik simply shook his head and stepped back while sheathing his blade.
Sorry, Grevin, but this is all on you. Your past did a lot of damage to your mind, your very soul. Your anger at me, at your past, at your actions don't forget. You don't forgive yourself. That gave us the strength we needed to make your nights a living hell. Were your inner demons.
He motioned to the twisted version of Pinkie Pie, who was still grinning from ear to ear with her sick and disgusting smile.
Take her, for example. I never was that creative when it was to coming up with monsters. Bravo!
He then moved to Rainbow Dash, who had allowed herself to hover in midair, her tail raised, allowing everything to be seen as she bared her razor-sharp teeth at him, attempting to send him a sultry, seductive look.
And her? Well, I don't even know how you could come up with this, but well done, you sick pervert.
Griffin growled and rose to his feet, clenching a fist, pulling it back, ready to strike when a lavender-colored magical aura seemed to envelop this fist and pulled him back, throwing him through the air, pinning him against the wall, forcing him to hang there, suspended off the ground and spread eagle. Davik simply shook his head once more as he looked to his left and right as two more ponies moved into view.
And these two? Well, there's something special, aren't they?
From the shadows, two evil-looking versions of Twilight Sparkle and Applejack walked into view, their forms dressed up in their Nightmare Night costumes. Applejack's mane was truly wild, and her fangs looked far more real than they did before, her saliva dripping from them as she stared at her prey with cold, calculating green eyes.
Howdy there, Sugar Q. You ready for a little fun?
Her voice was gruff, causing a chill to be sent down his spine. Twilight was wearing her Vampony costume, her fangs stained red. She was coming as if she was coming from a fresh kill, her eyes staring at him with what could only be defined as lust and hunger.
Hello, Gordon. You look good enough to eat.
She grinned as her tail flicked back and forth, showing her excitement. Grevin growled and tried to pull his hands free until some change burst from the wall. He used Pinto and wrapped around his arms and legs, holding him in place, no matter how much he tried to pull away. He could feel his pulse pounding in his skull, which seemed to catch the attention of Twilight. She took a few steps forward and gave a sultry smile at him as she looked up at him.
I can hear your blood flowing, Grevin. And your scent. Oh, I can smell your blood. Your fear.
She licked her lips as she moved closer and slowly nuzzled her cheek against his right thigh. Applejack, not to be outdone, moved forward and rose onto her back legs and began to nibble at his chest, her teeth easily tearing away his shirt, exposing his flesh to her.
I can't too. It smells good enough to eat. I can't wait to make you scream.
After she said that, she darted forward and bit down against his side, her razor-sharp teeth ripping through his skin, earning a cry of pain from her prey. She didn't let go and pulled back, ripping his flesh away, spilling his blood against her orange coat, his innards giving way to her teeth as she dug in. Grevin grunted, gasping for breath as he felt Applejack begin to lap at his wounds, her tongue trying to push into him as far as it could, seeking out his sweet, tasting blood, or her teeth ripped and dug into his flesh.
Oh, stop! Applejack! Twilight! Ugh!
He cried out as Twilight let out a hiss and quickly bit down on his inner thigh, her fangs easily passing through his pant leg and into a vein. He could feel her sucking at his blood, her tongue lapping at him as much as possible, savoring his taste. Davik leaned forward and laughed as he watched the mares devour their prey.
It's amazing how twisted your head can be, Grevin. These are your supposed friends? The ones you care about? Pathetic. I think I'm going to go now and leave you to your fate.
He turned and began to walk away, stopping only to look back over his shoulder.
Oh, and let's not forget about your other friends too, after all. I believe Rainbow Dash has been waiting to get a piece of you for a while now. Have fun.
Much to Grevin's horror, the twisted Pinkie Pie and Rainbow Dash ran and flew forward, heading straight to him, hunger clearly showing in their eyes. Grevin cried out in pain and began to fight against his chains, his fists clenching as Dash began to nibble at his collar, her razor-sharp teeth causing his blood to begin to drip down his shoulder to his chest. He could feel Pinkie Pie begin to pull off his boot, mumbling something about using his toes as cake toppers, which forced him to find a second wind and begin to struggle once again.
No, I'm not going to die this way. No, I will not let my own mind be the enemy. I will fight back. Get off me!
Grevin woke with a loud yell, his fist shooting out as he sat up, his momentum pulling him from the bed, causing him to fall to the floor. His body shook as he tried to gather his wits and take a few shaky breaths, the dream still vivid in his mind. He quickly ripped off his shirt and checked his side to see if there was an open wound, and when he saw none, he let out a slow but shaky, steadying breath. It wasn't real. It wasn't real. It was a dream. It was just a terrible nightmare. He placed his hand on the bed and slowly rose to his feet, his hand wiping the sweat from his brow to the floor. He took a few unsteady steps, making his way to the barn window, and much to his surprise, he found that he had slept far longer than intended. The sun in the sky was just beginning its downward arc, telling him it was well past noon, and that most likely the chores for the day were all but complete. He glanced across the yard to the farmhouse and noticed that it seemed unusually quiet. He didn't hear the sounds of Big Mac working in the field, nor the sound of Granny Smith moving around in the farmhouse. It seemed that the farm family knew to take a rest day from time to time. Griffin yawned a bit as he picked up a towel and began to wipe the cold sweat from his body, his mind trying to focus on anything but the nightmare he just had, with little success. Why would he dream about his friends being such terrible creatures? It just didn't sit well with him. Perhaps he needs to see a therapist? He shook his head once more as it began to change into a fresh set of clothes, decided to not put on his armor or cloak today. He stretched his arms above his head and popped his back and neck a few times before turning and making his way down the stairs and out the barn and into the farmyard. As he made his way through the barn, he noticed that Big Mac's tools were where they were the night before, confirming his suspicion that the farm ponies were taking it easy that day. Griffin glanced over at the farmhouse and decided that it would be best to avoid Applejack for the time being, so he turned and began to make his way back to Ponyville, deciding to explore a little bit more of the quaint village. Perhaps a change of his reclusive behavior will change his perspective on things. As the edge of town came into view, Griffin couldn't help but feel a small smile begin to form on his lips. Everything was bright and cheery, unlike his nightmare. There were various ponies of all sorts going about their daily routines, smiles adorning their faces. He saw the mint green unicorn mare that seemed stunned to meet him at his welcoming party, sitting on a park bench while her cream-colored friend with a two-tone mane laid on the same bench next to her, both engaged in a quiet conversation. As he made his way further into town, he found himself passing several shops, including a florist shop whose owner stopped what she was doing to wave a friendly hello to him as he passed by. He returned the wave with a small one of his own, turning down another street, missing the small hint of red that came to the mare's face after he was gone. Griffin eventually came across Town Hall, only to be stopped by the town mare. She gave a small wave as she trotted up to him, a bright smile on her face. "Oh, Mr. Hades, how are you today?" He smiled as he gave a polite bow, before standing straight once again and placing his hands behind his back.
Good afternoon to you, Miss Mare. I'm doing well, thank you. How are you?
She shook her head a bit as she grinned. "It's just Miss Mare. I'm not married. I'm doing wonderfully. My night was a tremendous success, partially thanks to you." He blinked and tilted his head to the side.
Thanks to me? I don't understand. I didn't do anything special.
She reached up and patted his arm, pausing on his bicep for a split second before returning her hoof to the ground. "Oh, but you did. Your interaction with the Princess Luna was wonderful. Miss Cheerily told me at lunch today that the children were thrilled to see a knight stand up to Nightmare Moon, only to be saved by them and their tributes. It made their night." She paused as she looked down a bit, a small frown adorning her lips. "Though, perhaps you should make a small appearance today at the school, in order to show the children that you made it out just fine."
I think that is an excellent idea. I'll make my way over to the schoolhouse and do an impromptu visit. Could you point me in the right direction, though?
Mare giggled and nodded as she pointed to the east where they stood. Of course, it's just a few blocks that way. Thank you again, Mr. Hades. This community is lucky to have you." He shook his head as he began to walk away.
That, Miss Mare, is simply a matter of opinion. Have a good day.
She smiled and waved as he made his way down the street, her eyes half lidding as she let her gaze linger on his backside while she lightly bit her bottom lip. "Oh, if I were a younger man. But then again, experience does have its benefits." She giggled to herself as she returned and made her way back up into Town Hall. Griffin continued on his way, moving a bit faster once the schoolhouse came into view. He knew it was beginning to get later in the afternoon, and he didn't want to be too late. He glanced inside the window, noting the large number of students sitting in their desks, doing what any child would do in a school situation. Some were being very active listeners, taking everything their teacher said in with great care to put it in their memory, while others looked on with a hint of boredom in their eyes. He had to laugh as he watched Applebloom's friend, Sweetie Belle, sit back with her eyes shut, sleeping with a small hint of drool coming out of her mouth. He made his way to the door and knocked lightly, taking a small breath to calm his nerves, as the lesson inside ceased, and the sound of footsteps moved closer and closer. The door opened and a familiar pink mare stuck her head out, a small smile on her lips. She paused a moment as her gaze shifted from his waist up to his chest, and then face, her smile being replaced with a bright grin.
Mr. Hades, what a pleasant surprise. What brings you here this afternoon?
Grevin cleared his throat a bit, and took a small step back, which just prompted her to step closer.
Well, I ran into Mare, and she suggested I come by and show the children that I am indeed quite all right after the events of Nightmare Night. I hope I'm not interrupting anything.
Cheerily shook her head quickly and stepped to the side, extending her hoof to let him in.
Not at all. Actually, I'm glad you're here. I think this would be a great opportunity for you to talk to the students and let them get to know you a little better.
He slowly stepped into the building, turning his head into the classroom, which had been bustling with activity until Applebloom noticed his presence and began to wave enthusiastically, a bright smile on her face.
Hi, Grevin. What are you doing here?
Instantly, the rest of the class became quiet as several pairs of eyes locked onto him, several growing wide with wonder, or perhaps fear, while a few seemed indifferent. He lightly cleared his throat as Cheerly moved up to his right.
All right, every pony, settle down. As it turns out, Mare felt that the events of Nightmare Night were a little too intense for some ponies, and many had grown worried for Mr. Hades' safety. As you can see, he is quite well, and in fact, he decided to come by today to even answer a few questions that some of you may have. I want to remind you that this is a great opportunity to learn about a completely different culture from someone who has had first-hand experience with it.
Grevin nodded and quietly crossed his arms across his chest and took a few small steps forward.
That's correct. I'll do my best to answer some questions, but I do reserve the right to not answer some of them. So, who would like to go first?
The response was immediate, as every colt and filly in the room raised their hooves into the air, some waving it frantically in an attempt to be called upon first. Grevin blinked in surprise, glancing at Cheerly, who simply giggled and pointed to a smaller colt with a pair of scissors for a cutie mark.
Snips, go ahead and ask your question.
The colt jumped up as several other ponies grumbled and pouted at missing the chance to ask their question.
Okay, my question is this. Is it true you're a warrior or fighter or something like that?
Grevin nodded as he lightly cleared his throat.
Well, yes, I am trained in combat and melee and ranged weapons, as well as being stealthy. I don't like to fight, though.
A light pink filly with a small tiara on her head stood up, ignoring the glares of her classmates as she rolled her eyes.
Like, if you hate fighting, then why are you so good at it? Sounds fishy to me.
Griffin lightly pinched the bridge of his nose, trying to ignore the tone of the filly's voice. He let his hands fall to his sides as he let out a soft sigh.
At first, I fought because it gave me recognition. It gave me a home. However, over time, I discovered that I was doing more harm than good. I decided to change with some help, of course. Eventually, I decided that I would use my skills to help others, to protect them.
A colt with an orange coat and brown mane stood up next.
Do you know how to use magic?
Grevin nodded, thankful he did not need to go into any more detail about his combat training.
I know some, but nothing like what a unicorn does here in Equestria. The best I can do is heal someone who has been injured. I've been told I have potential to do more, but I don't know how to develop those abilities. Another colt, this one with a blue coat and green mane, raised his hoof.
I heard you're evil and want to destroy villages and gobble up ponies. Is that true?
Griffin rolled his eyes and shook his head as he held his hands out to his sides.
Do I look like I want to gobble up any pony?
No, you look pretty nice.
He smiled.
Thank you. And the answer is no, I am not evil. I don't want to harm anyone or anything. Never let your opinion of someone be swayed by rumors you hear. More often than not, they aren't true.
Scootaloo stood up next, an excited grin on her face.
I heard you were thrown through a building and got up ready for more action. Did that really happen?
Grevin cringed and grimaced with a small nod.
Yeah, that did kind of hurt, though. A lot. You need to understand, I was trying to help stop a dragon attack in Counterlot, and the dragon happened to catch me with a sweep of his tail. I was sent flying and ended up going through the walls of a nice cafe, pretty much destroying the place. I did get back up and was ready for more, but that doesn't mean I didn't feel pain from it.
Another filly with a light brown coat and a blonde mane rose up to her hoofs.
Do you have any hobbies?
Griffin blinked and paused, clearly caught off guard by this question. He took a few moments to think before he answered.
Well, I do kind of. I guess you could say I like to train. I find it to be a great way to get my mind in focus for the day. I also enjoy history. Back in my homeland, I used to follow my mentor from ancient ruin to ancient ruin, discovering all kinds of neat historical facts. I also enjoy swimming and a good book from time to time.
Another filly stood up.
What was your homeland like?
Griffin smiled sadly and crossed his arms once more.
Bastion. Well, Bastion was nothing like Equestria. In Bastion, the members of royalty stood on the backs of those less fortunate. There were many who were poor and sick with no way to help themselves. I myself grew up as an orphan until I was old enough to join the military. There were many countries that would try to take over their neighbors and wage terrible wars with no concern for the consequences. Royalty never interacted with the common man, and if they did, it was to spite them, not to talk to them.
Sounds terrible.
Well, it wasn't all that bad. It all depends on who you meet. Several races were quite kind, such as the dwarves. They were very short people, with long beards who made their homes under the earth in vast cave cities. They knew how to make a person feel welcome. I believe it all depended on your perspective and the people you knew.
Sweetie Belle grinned as she stood up and cleared her throat.
Do you have a very special sun pony?
Griffin blinked a moment, freezing in place.
Oh, a what?
A special sun pony. A pony you like a lot, as in like, not just regular like.
Griffin swallowed, a small lump in his throat as a nervous chuckle escaped him.
Well, no, not really. I have several friends.
Would you want to go out with this one mare? I know, Sweetie Belle,
cheerily interrupted the filly with a stomp of her hoof.
Didn't you learn your lesson from last time?
Sweetie Belle simply gave a small sigh and nodded, her eyes downcast.
Yes, Miss Cheerly. I just thought he might like to have a mare friend.
Griffin smiled softly at the filly.
I appreciate the concern, but at the moment, I don't know if it would be good. I would be a good special sun pony material. Perhaps in the future, but for now I think it best to try and fit into society a bit more.
Cheerily cleared her throat, drawing the class's attention to her.
All right, children, it's time for you to go home for today. Say thank you to Mr. Hades and be on your way.
She turned to face Grevin as the children scattered, making their way outside. A nervous look on her face. She glanced down before taking a small breath.
Uh, Mr. Hades, I was wondering if I could ask you a question.
Grevin nodded as he let himself rest back against her desk, his arms crossed comfortably.
Ask away, Miss Shirley. What do you need?
She glanced over her shoulder, watching as the last little filly darted out the door, leaving the two alone in the now quiet classroom. After a few awkward seconds, she took a small breath and looked up, locking eyes with the man before her.
Well, I was wondering that since you do come from another world, would you be interested in learning more about equestrian society? I could arrange for us to meet here some evenings, and I could tutor you in all sorts of things. I could even bring some sandwiches for a snack.
Grevin blinked a moment, confusion showing in his eyes.
So, you want to teach me about how things work here in Equestria?
She smiled and nodded, her eyes shining with mirth.
Yes, I love teaching, and I know it must be difficult coming to a world where so many things are different from where you came from. I thought this would be a good opportunity to help you.
He smiled warmly and nodded.
That would be wonderful, Miss Shirley. I would be very grateful for the help. But I don't want to take time out of your social life, not to mention make you do more work without pay. I insist you let me return the favor somehow.
Shirley giggled and nodded as she did a little spin where she stood, her joy evident.
That's perfectly fine, Mr. Hades. I'm sure I can think of something you can help me with around here.
Oh, and one thing, please.
She stopped instantly and blinked, looking at him.
Yes?
Please, call me Grevin. Mr. Hades just doesn't feel right.
She smiled and nodded as she sat on her haunches.
Fair enough, and please call me Shirley.
All right, Shirley. He rose back to his feet. Well, if you will excuse me, I should probably make my way over to the library. I need to do a little bit of research about an old legend of sorts. Take care, Shirley. Have a good afternoon.
Shirley watched him as he walked out the door, a small smirk on her lips as her eyes lingered on his form.
You too, Grevin. I'll let you know when you should come over for that tutoring session. She watched him make his way back into town through the window, a small giggle escaping her when she noticed Applebloom, Scootaloo, and Sweetie Belle all galloping after her, bright smiles on their faces. I wonder how good he is with children. Perspective change. Applebloom rolled her eyes as she listened to her friend Sweetie Belle try to suggest they play matchmaker with Grevin, as though she didn't learn her lesson the first time around with Cheerily and Big Mac. Sweetie Belle, we already tried to do that, and it nearly cost us the farm and our teacher. Sweetie Belle frowned and shook her head as she looked at the yellow farm pony. I know that it was a failure, but if we find Grevin a mare friend and they hit it off, we could get our kitty marks in matchmaking. Scootaloo shrugged her shoulders. I don't think so. The last thing I think we should do is try to make another love poison and use it on him. After all, we saw what it did to Big Mac. Imagine what it could do to Grevin. Sweetie Belle let out an exasperated sigh as she face-offed. I'm not talking about using that stupid love poison again. That was a disaster. I'm thinking that maybe we should introduce him to a few of the ponies here in town. Or maybe help him get into a romantic situation with some pony? Applebloom glanced at the schoolhouse where she could see Grevin speaking to her teacher. Well, maybe he would be able to fall in love with some pony he already knows. Her eyes widened and she gasped before doing a little hop. Oh, what if he liked Applejack? I mean, he is staying at the farm. They already know one another and get along real well. Scootaloo gasped and then nodded, her wings fluttering excitedly. Ooh, he knows Rainbow Dash too. She's awesome. Sweetie Belle fumed and stomped a hoof down. He knows my sister too, you know. Maybe he would like Rarity? Applebloom rose her hoof to speak up once more, but was interrupted by the schoolhouse door opening
causing her to dart forward and quickly quiet her two friends just as Grevin walked out into the afternoon air. Grevin blinked as he came across the three fillies, slowing his steps as he noticed their eyes watching him quite closely. Hi girls. What are you up to? Sweetie Belle stepped forward and shrugged her shoulders, letting her gaze shift enough to attempt her to make her look nonchalant.
Oh, just thinking of ideas of how to earn our cutie marks.
He smiled knowingly and lightly crossed his arms.
I hope you're not planning to do anything more with fire.
Scootaloo laughed and shook her head.
No way, we learned our lesson last time. Though, now that I think about it, it was pretty awesome how you rescued us from that treehouse.
Applebloom ran up to Grevin's leg and put a hoof on his knee.
So, where are you going, Grevin?
He reached down and ruffled her mane, earning a small giggle from the filly.
I'm going to the library to do some research. Perhaps you should join me and do some research of your own. You may find a few ideas of how to earn your cutie marks.
Scootaloo grinned and hopped into the air for a moment.
You really think we'll be able to find a way to get our cutie marks?
It couldn't hurt to take a crack at it. Come on, let's go.
With that, he turned and began to make his way through the village, the three fillies giggling and laughing as they followed, their minds already forgetting their conversation moments ago. The walk to the library was enjoyable enough, especially with the young fillies playing tag as they went, but Grevin wasn't truly focused on them and their antics. His thoughts were occupied with concern about seeing Twilight after the awkward situation from the night before. Couple that with the intense nightmare he had, and he didn't feel terribly comfortable having to work with her. He knew that she would never do him harm, and perhaps his mind was running away with things, but the pain he felt in that dream from her bite was so vivid, so real. He just couldn't seem to push it from his mind. He couldn't help but worry that she would try to continue things from the night before as well. She seemed very focused on her actions, so certain of herself that it made him nervous. He had to admit that the feeling of her lips on his was indeed enjoyable, but he wasn't sure he wanted it to be. It was the same with Fluttershy. If he kept himself distant, then he risked no harm to his heart, but if he opened up, he could experience more joy than he could imagine. His thoughts were forced to the back of his mind as he approached the door to the library. Its windows opened wide, allowing the nice breeze and sunshine away into the building. He reached up and knocked 3 times, and seconds later, a cheerful voice called from inside.
Come in.
He opened the door, allowing the 3 CMC to enter right before walking in as well, surprised to find that all signs of the previous night were gone. The room was bright and cheerful, the books shelved in a very detailed order, and in the center of the room sat Twilight with several thick, ancient-looking texts on the round table behind her, ready to be studied. Twilight smiled, looking up at Grevin as he made his way into the room, clearly showing that she was back to her old self, no longer wearing stockings or a black choker. Her eyes had also returned to their naturally bright lavender shade, and as they locked onto his form, her bright smile revealing that her fangs were gone as well. She looked down at the CMC and immediately shifted it into librarian mode.
Hello, everypony. What can I help you with today?
Scootaloo stepped forward.
Grevin suggested we might be able to do some research on how to get our cutie marks here. Do you have any books that could help us with that?
Twilight raised a hoof to her chin as she sat back and thought. After a few moments, she sighed and shook her head.
I'm sorry, girls. I don't have anything quite like that. But I do have a lot of great books you can enjoy here. Maybe if you read some of them, they could provide some inspiration for you.
Sweetie Belle grinned and did a small hop.
That's a great idea. What books do you have?
Twilight grinned and quickly hopped up, moving to a nearby shelf.
I know, I think I have one you'll just love.
Her horn lit up, and seconds later, a paperback book became enveloped in her magical energies, and it floated down and hovered in front of the three fillies.
Here we are. Daring Do in the Ruins of Peril. I think she's a great character. I think you three can easily relate to. She has all kinds of adventures in far-off places. She's a great role model for young ponies everywhere.
Scaloo rolled her eyes. I don't know. She seems kind of lame to me. Twilight smirked and leaned forward a bit.
Rainbow Dash loves this series too, you know.
Within 3 seconds, the fillies had taken the book and run off to a nearby table in the library to read their new prize. Twilight blinked a moment before giggling softly and moving back over to where Grevin stood.
Good afternoon, Grevin. I'm guessing you're here to do some research?
Grevin shifted on his feet, taking a small step back from the lavender pony, his mind providing him with a brief flashback to his nightmare, where she had bit into his leg. He quickly shoved the mental image aside and nodded. Yes, I believe so. I'm guessing those books there are what we have to work with. She glanced over her shoulder at the large, ancient books before nodding.
Yes, these are all books I have that refer to that time period. Hopefully we'll find something about the spectral knights and the elements of valor.
She turned and quickly made her way over to the books, sitting herself down on a large cushion, her horn lighting up once again. Her magical aura enveloped a large tome sitting at the top of the stack, and levitated it down in front of her, opening it to the first few pages. She looked up at Grevin once more, a soft smile on her lips.
Well, come on. I can't wait to start.
Grevin blinked, surprised at her enthusiasm, before smiling a bit. He made his way around and quietly sat beside her, taking care not to get too close. All right, you might as well get to it. Grevin honestly couldn't help but be surprised at how quickly Twilight dove into the research. She gave no indication that she had even given a thought about what happened the night before. She didn't look at him awkwardly or longingly, nor did she say anything about it. Perhaps he had been thinking too much about such things, and should just let the subject drop. After all, it was just a simple kiss that happened after a long night of partying. It didn't mean anything. His thoughts were interrupted, though, when he felt something soft press on the top of his right thigh. He glanced over, and much to his surprise, he found that Twilight had slid over and had placed a single hoof ever so gently on his leg. He followed her leg up to her face, noting that she wasn't even looking at him, but a small smile on her face, and her cheeks had a small hint of red to them. Grevin slowly swallowed the lump that formed on the back of his throat, as a single thought ran through his mind. Damn it. He quickly pulled himself to the side, forcing Twilight's hoof off of him and letting it fall to the ground. She blinked and turned her head, tilting it to the side ever so slightly.
Grevin, are you all right?
He nodded as he adjusted his sitting position so that he would be somewhat comfortable while sitting halfway on and halfway off the cushion on the floor. Yes, I'm fine. Why?
Aren't you a little uncomfortable sitting like that?
She patted the empty space next to her tail flicking slightly as she did so.
You can scoot over, you know. I don't bite.
He quickly reached over to the stack of books, taking one from the top. Oh, that's okay. I tend to spread out when I read, so I wanted to make sure I give you plenty of room. Twilight smirked, her eyes taking on a mischievous glint as she ever so slightly bit her bottom lip, her ear twitching slightly. Grevin felt his cheeks begin to redden under her gaze, and he quickly opened the text, knowing that if things continued, she would soon have the sexy librarian look going, and he would be doomed. However, much to his chagrin, he found that the print in the book he held was completely unreadable to him. He heard Twilight chuckle once more before her magic took the book from his hand and closed it, moving it back to the stack he pulled it from.
Grevin, these are all written in ancient Equestrian, and since I'm trained to read that while you are not, we're going to have to read these together.
His jaw dropped. She had him where she wanted him, and she knew it. He knew that if he tried to argue, she could inform the princesses that he wasn't following his mission. A knight always did their best to complete a mission, even if it meant a personal cost. He knew he had to man up, even if he didn't want to at that particular moment. He slowly sit himself back over and nodded as he accepted his fate. Once again, for a while, the two sat quietly while Twilight read, and once again, after a few moments, a familiar lavender hoof found itself on his thigh. In that moment, a new thought ran through Grevin's mind. Oh, fuck me. Several hours later, Scoobaloo grinned as she closed the Daring Do book, glancing around at her two friends, noting the smiles on their faces too.
That was awesome!
Applebloom nodded.
Yep, that Daring Do was pretty neat.
Scoobaloo smiled in agreement.
Yeah, but did the story help inspire any ideas as to how we could earn our cutie marks?
For a few moments the three sat in silence until Applebloom slapped down a hoof, her eyes widening in excitement.
I've got it! The book tells a story about how Daring Do explores an ancient ruin, right?
Yeah, so? Applebloom rolled her eyes as she looked to her orange friend.
So, what if we get our cutie marks in exploring ruins?
Sweetie Belle shook her head.
That's a good idea, but there aren't any ruins around here, A.B.
Applebloom sighed as she sat back down, but before more could be said, a loud sigh from across the room caught her attention, drawing the entire group's eyes to where Grevin and Twilight sat. Perspective change. Grevin couldn't take much more. So far they made their way through over half the tomes that Twilight had brought, and had made no progress at all. In the meantime, Twilight had been teasing him, just a little bit at first, a simple hoof on his thigh. However, she began to step things up as time progressed. Slowly, she had begun to lightly run her hoof up and down his thigh, causing him to tense up and blush a bit, which did nothing but encourage the lavender mare. After a while, he felt her tail begin to flick against his arm, its silken hair brushing over his exposed skin, making it break out in goosebumps. He pulled his arm back, glancing over at Twilight once more. He found that she was still absorbed with what book she was reading, but she had a sexy little smirk adorning her lips, making her look anything but innocent. For a time, her actions ceased, and her hoof even returned to the floor in front of her, giving him a moment of peace, which didn't last very long. Seconds later, her horn began to glow, very faintly, and Grevin quickly tensed as he felt something touching him. The sensation began at his feet and began to slide up his legs, squeezing his thighs as it moved closer to his groin and backside. Grevin let out a loud sigh and quickly moved back from the table, while rising to his feet, which disrupted Twilight's magic, ceasing the pleasant tingling he felt. Twilight frowned slightly, a small pout forming on her lips as she turned to face the tense man.
Are you all right?
Grevin crossed his arms and shook his head. Yes and no. We've been researching for a good while here, Twilight. Have you found anything mentioning spectral knights or elements of valor? She sighed and shook her head.
No, not a bit. It's almost as though all information has been purged from history. It doesn't make any sense. There aren't any myths hinting at them. Perhaps King Solaris decided that it would be best to keep them secret?
Grevin pinched the bridge of his nose, closing his eyes a moment, his patience nearly gone after being teased for several hours. I think I need to go back to the castle ruins. I can't shake the feeling that I'll find some sort of answer there. Twilight frowned and jumped up, shaking her head frantically.
Grevin, no. We still have many texts to go through. We aren't done yet.
He stepped back and shook his head as he let his hands drop. Twilight, I can't read these texts. You can, and it's quite clear that you are better suited for this than I am. Don't worry, I'll be very careful when I go. She sighed and looked down.
All right, but I want to go with you, and bring along some of our friends, just in case.
He nodded after a few moments. Fine, I can accept that. Tell you what, let's call it a day and start fresh in the morning.
She nodded. All right. You can meet me here at about 10 o'clock.
All right. See you then. He turned and walked out of the library, leaving a frowning Twilight behind him. She quickly turned and grunted in frustration, making her way into the kitchen to make herself a daisy sandwich. Perspective change. Applebloom grinned and did a small dance of joy after hearing the conversation across the room.
Girls, did you hear that?
Scootaloo nodded.
Yeah, Grevin didn't sound too happy.
Applebloom rolled her eyes and shook her head.
Not that. I'm talking about the fact that we do have ruins around here. And since we have ruins...
She let the statement hang in the air as Sweetie Belle made the connection and beamed at her friend.
We can explore them and get our cutie marks.
Scootaloo's wings fluttered in excitement.
Sweet. So, when should we go?
Applebloom smiled.
Let's get up really early tomorrow morning and go when the sun rises. We'll explore them and get our cutie marks and be back before lunch.
The three fillies looked at one another and nodded, each one smiling excitedly at their friends. Silently, they left the library, hurrying to their clubhouse to plan out what supplies they would need for the next great adventure.